Saat Farkı'ndan merhabalar. Her hafta farklı ülkelerden, farklı milletlerden konuklarla bölgesel ve küresel meselelere dair farklı perspektiflere yer vermeye çalışıyoruz. Bu hafta aslında oldukça önemli olan ama belki de yeterince işlemediğimiz bir konuyu, iklim değişikliğini ve etkilerini konuşacağız. Bu konularda uzun yıllardır yazıp çizen İngiliz gazeteci, ödüllü çevre ve iklim muhabiri Gaia Vince konuğum olacak. Kendisinin çeşitli kitapları var bu alanda ve son olarak yeni bir kitabı da kısa bir süre önce çıktı. Ekranda da göreceksiniz birazdan. Nomad Century, How Climate Migration Will Reshape Our World. Göçebe yüzyıl, iklim göçü dünyamızı nasıl yeniden şekillendirecek? Kitabı geçtiğimiz haftalarda çıktı. Bugün biraz bu konuyu konuşacağız. Özetle kitapta şu söyleniyor aslında, önümüzdeki 50 yılda dünyanın birçok bölgesinde iklim şartları insanların yaşamasına uygun olmayacak ve iklim göçleri artacak. Bunun da sosyal, siyasal ve ekonomik açılardan muazzam etkileri olacak diyor kitap. Ve Gaia Vince bununla başa çıkmak için de çeşitli çözüm önerileri sunuyor. Bugün bunları konuşacağız biraz. Welcome Gaia, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure. Congratulations, by the way, on your new book. First, well, it's not in Turkish yet, so let me ask you, please, could you please tell us about your book? How did you come up with the idea of writing this book? Because you have written a lot of books on the issues of climate and climate change, climate migration, etc. So how different is this book than the previous ones? So could you please summarize your main arguments for our Turkish audience? Thank you very much.
Yes, and sorry not to do it in Turkish. Unfortunately, my Turkish is pretty non-existent, so it will be in English, so forgive me for that. What we are facing over the coming decades is truly a crisis that humanity has never experienced before. This is unprecedented. We are going to increasingly see large parts of the globe, mainly around the tropics, around coastlines, around rivers where most of our cities are, deserts, lots of areas where the majority actually of the population lives, becoming uninhabitable. So you've heard about the need to mitigate climate change, to cut down our carbon emissions. Mm-hmm. You've probably also heard that we all need to adapt to climate change. But what you haven't heard, and what nobody is talking about, is the fact that for large numbers of people living in large parts of the world, there is no way for them to adapt. They are going to have to move. And this book was born out of frustration that we're not talking about this. And really, it's a manifesto, it's a plan for how we deal with the coming decades, the century to come, the century of movement. And I am saying we need to plan to manage this migration. We need to plan to manage where people move across borders to safety.
Gaia, in the book, your main focus is on, as you said, planned migration rather than reducing the impact of the global warming and climate change. So is it too late to prevent or at least slow down the process? Are you very pessimistic about that, the future of the climate change?
Absolutely. While we are undergoing this upheaval, we will be mitigating, we will be cutting our carbon emissions. Not just that, we will reach net zero, but then we need to cut below net zero. That means we need to withdraw the carbon that we have already emitted from the atmosphere. Absolutely, we need to do that. There are lots of books on how to do that. I go into details in Nomad Century of how to do that as well. This is really a pragmatic response. Migration is now inevitable. Climate migration is inevitable. We must manage it so that we don't end up with a catastrophic conflict, wars, bad management of food systems, energy systems. We need to have a plan and we need to talk about this. And this is a book of solutions.
I see. I would love to hear your solutions, by the way, but first I want to ask you this also. According to the United Nations, approximately 21.5 million people had to migrate each year since 2008 due to weather conditions such as floods, storms, hurricanes, and extreme drought. This is a huge number, by the way. I mean, as a person and as a journalist, I was not aware of this huge number. So shall we expect more? Obviously, you think we have to expect more. And also, I want to ask you, I mean, because, you know, we usually associate migration with wars, conflicts, especially in the Middle East in particular. So could you tell us this climate migration, is it already happening? It is already happening, obviously. And how serious is it? And what should we expecting for the near future?
Yes, I mean, climate migration is already happening and it is increasing. We see that particularly in parts of Latin America. We see people moving northwards across the border into the United States. We see it across parts of Asia as well. And increasingly in parts of Africa. It is already a big problem. It's tied up in multiple other causes, everything from poverty to inequality. But a lot of this is driven by changes to the climate, by increasing droughts, heat waves, catastrophic floods. Pakistan's 1/3 of the country is underwater. We've seen terrible heat waves everywhere from the United States across Asia, Africa. We're seeing hunger related to that from Yemen to Mali. I mean, these are huge problems. But I mean, if we look at the scale, it is going to be unprecedented. We're seeing this increase in migration, but it's nothing compared to what we're expecting. By 2050, possibly 1 billion people will need to move. I mean, globally, the number of people exposed to coastal flooding alone is projected to rise from 250 million at the moment to more than 1 billion by 2050. And 2050 is actually quite soon. We're talking about the scale of most people's mortgages. You know, this is not a long way away. And so we need to have a plan of how on earth we're going to manage it. I mean, Turkey has experienced drought. You know what we're talking about here. It affects everything from agriculture to hydropower. It's a huge problem.
Mm-hmm. And could you give us some examples, like, I mean, which will be the cities to live, like, for example, best and worst places, let's say, to live? Because I have seen another report, Middle East is warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. So which places are really at risk? Which ones are luckier, let's say? And could you give us some examples?
So if you look at the globe, there is a tropical band across the equator, which is increasingly going to be unlivable. At the moment, about 5% of the world's planet is unlivable. Mm-hmm. We're going to see that rising possibly to 25% in the decades to come. That's a quarter of the world's population, quarter of the world's land surface, and the places where the biggest and densest populations are. So we're talking about a band across Asia, the Middle East, across Africa, across South and Central and the south bit of the United States. I mean, nowhere is going to be unaffected by climate change, but some places are better able to adapt. They have the climate change that they're going to experience, the more extreme conditions, are things that people can adapt to. The institutions are stronger. Mm-hmm. The populations are already less dense. They in fact depend on immigration because they're suffering from demographic shortfall anyway. They're not having enough babies. They actually would benefit from immigration. So what we're seeing is people are gradually going to move northwards to up to a new greener Arctic Circle. And I mean, if you look at the globe again, it's the northern latitudes that have the land. In the south, you know, the continents are sort of ice cream cone shaped, so there isn't a lot of land there. So people are going to move northwards. I mean, some places are going to lose their entire nation. If you look at the Pacific Island nations, Tuvalu, Kiribati, Maldives, huge coastal change. Places like Bangladesh, of course, we're going to lose enormous amounts of land. These are very, very heavily populated countries. Mm-hmm. Turkey will not be unaffected by this. Parts of Turkey will also become uninhabitable. Around the Mediterranean, southern Spain, parts of Greece will be uninhabitable. People will have to move north. But to a certain extent, places like that are better able to adapt. They have smaller, more manageable populations already. So things can change, but generally the population is going to move north to cities that will expand to accept them, and entirely new cities that will have to be built.
So it's very likely, Gaia, as far as I understand, the relocation will be from low-income populations to high-income countries. Do you think they will be willing to accept? I mean, you touched upon the benefits, some benefits of it, but what do you think? What are the risks and opportunities for the developed countries in particular, and what are the risks for them?
I mean, there is no doubt that this is a hugely radical proposal. It is unprecedented. It may sound a bit crazy that millions, hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of people are going to have to relocate from southern states to predominantly white, predominantly Christian states. But the crisis that we are facing is utterly unprecedented. We really are facing a completely different world. We're on the edge at the moment. We will pass 1.5 degrees perhaps within the next 6 years, and then climate tipping points are enacted. Almost certainly we will lose coral reefs. The Greenland glacier is on the verge of passing a tipping point. The Gulf Stream is also looking really unstable at the moment. We are facing a very, very different world. Now, we can respond to this by putting up borders, by continuing along the path that many nations have done now. That way leads to conflict. Borders will not, walls and borders, armies will not be able to keep people out. It will just be catastrophic economically, catastrophic socially, politically. That is not the answer. Sooner or later, we will realize that many of the border regimes that we have in place are not fit for a world of a completely transformed culture. We are going to have to change this. Much better that we make the initial investment, and that is not a small investment, but the initial investment in making sure that migratory passage is granted for people, that this is treated as a movement of labor. This is a workforce movement. This is not a security issue. It is an economic issue and a humanitarian issue, and that people actually are given the tools, the social, the infrastructure tools, housing and access to healthcare and so on, and the inclusion in these new societies so that they can help build new, healthy, productive, economically viable cities of the future. Because the alternative is horrific, and I haven't heard from anybody a plan, an alternative plan that is not absolutely disastrous. So, I think we need to start talking about this. I mean, people will not agree. They may not agree with all of the solutions that I propose in Nomad Century, but we need to start this conversation and to just, to just insist that it's impossible straight away, as some commentators may, that is not a solution either. We do have choices at the moment. The future is unwritten, but unless we engage with those choices, unless we honestly face up to what is approaching us in terms of the Earth system and what is approaching us in terms of the people that are going to have to move, well, we are not dealing with this. We're not coming up with a management plan.
Are you, Gaia, by the way, because some people are criticizing you for being too optimistic, even unrealistic. So are you proposing a kind of a world which doesn't have any borders or something? So basically, let's say, no nation states anymore. So are you proposing that or...
I mean, there are so many different solutions to this, different governance solutions. I mean, borders are a relatively new invention. They've only been around for 200 to 300 years. They came with they really arose with the French, the idea of nation states and so on, arose with the French Revolution, the revolutions of Latin America. They're not that new, actually. And most of the borders we know now were only created over the last 100 years. So they're not set in stone. But I'm not even saying that. I'm just saying that the way we treat, if you think about about the way we treat our resources, our commodities, how we trade them across borders, how we try and negotiate easier trade routes for all of these things because it's economically beneficial for all of us. The biggest resource that we have economically is labor, is human labor, and yet we put so many restrictions in place. There have been studies that that calculate that if all borders were removed, the global GDP would soar by at least $1 trillion immediately, because borders they handicap us. They get in the way of economic progress. Most people migrate to work. They move to where the work is. They don't choose to move where there are no jobs. And if there are jobs there, that is because there is a need for their labor. So, and it is not a zero-sum game at all. You know, if migrants move to an area, they don't take the jobs from the native people. It doesn't work like that. The more people there are of working age who are allowed to work, who are permitted to work, the more that economy grows. It is a system which is greater than the sum of its parts. That's why cities are so productive. People come and they create their own economic demand, and they create their own economically productive systems. We need to help them do that. It does take investment. It does take social inclusion, and we've all seen what happens when migrants are welcomed across but not given that social inclusion. If you look at what's happened in Sweden recently, migrants have arrived, but they have been utterly segregated from society. And as a result, they're not part of the formal economy. They're not able to contribute in the same way, and that's where you get conflict, division, and unfortunately increase in prejudice.
Yes, and it's everywhere, not only in Sweden. Yeah, unfortunately. But
everywhere.
And Gaia, do you think climate migrants will be treated differently? How can we ensure a more just treatment of climate migrants other than, other migrants, let's say? But the climate migrants will be treated differently, do you believe, do you hope?
I mean, at the moment we have this very poisonous narrative towards many migrants. If you're coming across as an investor or as a top surgeon, you're treated incredibly different from if you're coming across, fleeing the farm where you lived because it's completely impossible to work, and you're coming across to help as a factory worker or a farm labourer in another country which actually needs your work. This level of prejudice has not been challenged properly and thoroughly in society. Social change is actually it can happen very, very rapidly, very quickly, given the right tools, but we have not been using those tools. I mean, some places do it better than others, but it's an active tool that you must use to help propel social cohesion, because this is happening whether we like it or not. We can either continue in our separate silos, looking down on people from some other country for whatever reason, or we can get together and form the 21st century inclusive societies that together help. We have so many other bigger problems to deal with. This is a century of upheaval, creating a sustainable cities that work with different food systems, energy systems, materials. This century is all change. We're going to need all the help we can get, and we will only do this through cooperation.
Well, hopefully we can get there. Time is almost up, Gaia. My last question. I think you're based in London, right?
Yeah, that's right.
You have any future plans in the near future, let's say, to live, to migrate to? Because
London will be affected.
Yes,
it's already been
what
affected.
I'm asking.
Yeah, well, of course, I have 2 young children, and it's very important to me that we live somewhere where they're not going to be affected by heat waves. We may well move further north, yeah.
Okay, so we will talk after a few years, let's say, again. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
I appreciate your interest.
Thank you. Evet, Saat Farkı'nda bu hafta Gaia Vince'i ağırladık. İngiliz gazeteci, iklim ve çevre muhabiri. Kendisinin yeni bir kitabı çıktı yakın zaman önce. Göçebe Yüzyıl, iklim göçü dünyamızı nasıl yeniden şekillendirecek? Tekrar ekrana gelmiş oldu. İngilizce takip etmek isteyenler de kitabı okuyabilirler. Bu hafta da böylelikle Saat Farkı'nı tamamlamış olduk. Önümüzdeki hafta yine farklı bir konuyla, farklı bir konukla görüşmek dileğiyle. Hoşçakalın.